Hi, this is Tara. Today let's study Sutra number 33. Maitrī-karuṇā-muditā-upekṣānāṃ sukha-duḥkha-puṇya-apuṇya-viṣayāṇāṃ bhāvanātaḥ citta-prasādanam. What does this mean? Maitrī, friendliness, karuna, compassion, mudita, gladness, upeksha, that is disinterest, or it can also be translated as equanimity, indifference. Sukha, pleasure, dukkha, suffering. Punya, virtue, apunya, or punya can also be auspiciousness. Apunya, that is virtue or inauspiciousness. And vishaya, that is the object of the senses, the subject of contemplation. Bhavana, conceptualizing. Chitta, of the mind. Prasadana, soothing, calming. So how does Maharishi Vedavyasa basically understand or explain this sutra? He says that by cultivating habits of friendliness, compassion, complacency, and the indifference towards happiness, misery, virtue, and vice, the mind becomes pure. So he is basically answering the question, how is the mind secured? Now, the mind becomes pure by cultivating these habits of friendliness, compassion, complacency, and indifference towards happiness, misery, virtue, and vice. So he says, let him cultivate in his mind the habit of friendliness towards all those who are found in the enjoyment of pleasure, compassion towards those who are suffering from pain, complacency towards those who are virtuous, and indifference towards the vicious, thus habituating the mind to these notions. The white characteristic makes appearance. When he says white characteristic, he means luminosity, light. Thus the mind becomes pure. Having become pure, it can become one-pointed and attain the state of steadiness. So how does Swami Satyananda explain? I'm sure you have questions about why are we indifferent towards evil, and why should we be why should we have complacency to those who are virtuous? So Swami Satyananda, who translates it as, in relation to happiness, misery, virtue, and vice, by cultivating the attitudes of friendliness, compassion, gladness, and indifference respectively, the mind becomes purified and peaceful. So Swami Satyananda says it is impossible to practice or to attain the concentration of the mind if the mind is disturbed. And the way to cultivate it is what is being explained in the sutra, to gain that sort of undisturbed mind, right? That is eventually the aim. And it is by cultivating friendliness, compassion, gladness, and indifference in respect to people or events which are causing happiness, misery, virtue, or vice. And by maintaining this attitude, friendly to the happy, compassion for the unhappy, gladness for the virtuous, and indifference to those who are full of vice, the mind and the aspirant become free from disturbing influences. So what they're basically saying is the mind its inherent nature is to have vacillations, to go up and down. As Swami Vivekananda explains, the vrittis are basically ripples in the lake of the mind. So how do we still this? By cultivating these four qualities. And he says that it is explained in the Kathopanishad that the mind has a tendency to be attracted towards the outside world. So when you're turning it inwards, you need to purify the obstacles and remove the impurities. So things like jealousy, things like anger, when we see somebody and we feel jealous because they are wealthy or they have something we don't have, this creates a disturbance in the mind, even at the very subconscious level. And so when we have these kinds of disturbances, how can we concentrate the mind in yoga? That is just not possible. So when you cultivate these feelings of compassion and kindness and gladness, the mind is able to be much more calm. So it's not just because we are getting into the territory of the yamas. it is not just a social good. It is not just that, oh, you must be like this and then you will be a very nice person in society and everybody will love you. It is not that. What are we essentially doing when we cultivate virtues? It is not moralizing. It is stilling the mind. You cannot have anger, you cannot have jealousy, you cannot have pity or rage or fakeness, inauthenticity, and still concentrate the mind. The mind, ultimately what we are doing is trying to get some sort of control over the mind, stillness in the mind. So for all of that, these qualities have to be cultivated. Swami Vivekananda says, friendship, mercy, gladness, indifference, being thought of in regard to subjects, happy, unhappy, good and evil, respectively, pacify the citta. So he says we must have these four sorts of ideas: friendship, mercy, gladness, indifference. We must have friendship for all. We must be merciful towards those who are in misery. When people are happy, we ought to be happy, and to the wicked, we must be indifferent. So with all subjects that come before us, if the subject is a good one, we should feel friendly towards it. If it is a miserable one, we should be merciful towards it. If it is good, we should be glad, and if it is evil, we should be indifferent. And these attitudes of the mind towards the different subjects that come before it make the mind peaceful. So most of our difficulties in daily life, in our day-to-day lives, come in these forms, is what Swami Vivekananda explains. So every reaction in the form of hatred or evil is so much a loss to the mind, and every evil thought or deed or hatred or any thought of reaction, if it is controlled, will be laid in our favor. It is not that we lose by restraining ourselves, we gain infinitely more. Just because you are not reacting at a material level, don't think that you have not had your say or that you have missed the chance to control your mind. Okay, so each time you suppress a feeling of hatred or anger, or you restrain yourself from speaking harshly, don't think you've lost that battle. You've gained something else in that process, is what Swami Vivekananda is saying, and it all accrues towards this control over the citta. B.K. Iyengar says, through cultivation of friendliness, compassion, joy and indifference to pleasure and pain, virtue and vice, the consciousness becomes favorably disposed, serene and benevolent. So these qualities keep the mind in a state of well-being. And he is basically laying the groundwork for self-realization. So B.K. Iyengar explains that citta vikshepa, that is the disturbance of the citta, is basically like this torrent. It's like a running river of disturbed thoughts running through the center of the mind. You might have awareness of this, like late at night, and some memory is coming up, some anger is coming up, and it's just running. He says that's like a raging river running through the mind. Citta vikshepa, that is the disturbed mind. And what we want is citta-prasādanam, that is graceful diffusion, like a gentle rippling of the lake. So we're trying to turn this into this. Okay, so if the citta is caught in the web of the senses and the sadhaka fails to cultivate friendliness, compassion, delight and equanimity, sorrow and unhappiness arise in his heart. And the sutra asks us to rejoice with the happy, be compassionate with the sorrowful, friendly to the virtuous and indifferent to those who continue to live, create evil or harm, despite you're telling them they're continuing to do this. You have to cultivate indifference. And besides cultivating these qualities, one should also follow the social virtues of yama for the well-being of society as a whole. And this approach keeps the sadhaka serene and pure. Osho gets a bit, into depth with this. So if you're interested, you might want to find his text and sort of read it. And he says the mind becomes tranquil by cultivating attitudes of friendliness towards the happy, compassion towards the miserable, joy towards the virtuous, and indifference towards evil. And in this he's saying exactly what everybody else has said, but he goes much more into depth in his explanation, and he says, but why? First understand all these things before you can understand the sutra. And he says, when you see somebody who's happy or successful, you feel jealous, not happy. You feel miserable, and this is our natural attitude. And Patanjali says the mind becomes tranquil by cultivating the counter attitude, friendliness towards the happy. And this is very, very difficult. Most of us understand this, right? Why he got, why I didn't get, why she got, why I didn't get. Okay, so to be friendly with somebody who's happy is actually very, very difficult. Okay, Osho says, as he's explaining what Patanjali says. And he says, but happiness is basically a state of mind. It's not a thing. It's not like gold that if I give it to somebody, it gets divided, right? Happiness is an attitude of the mind. So therefore, being abstract, it can be shared. It can be very easily shared. It's not like gold, that if I have this gold and if I give it away, I will be diminished. Giving away your happiness, giving joy, giving, empathy, these are never going to diminish you. So it is actually very easy to share. And what happens is, it multiplies in this form. So when somebody is happy, let's say your neighbor is won some major contract and he's made a lot of money and is very happy, and you're happy, take his happiness. His happiness is not diminished. Enjoy with him, enjoy for him, and therefore you have gotten part of his happiness, and that itself will change you. That itself will allow you to feel happiness. So he says, very beautiful thing Osho says is, always seek the company of those who are higher than you, higher in wisdom, higher in happiness, higher in tranquility, calmness, quiet, collectedness, whatever quality you admire. Seek people who have more of it than you, and that way you will also imbibe it. And Osho says that this is a ladder. This is how you ascend in life. If you're constantly seeking people who are higher than you, better than you, who have more than you, who know more than you, and you're happy with them and you enjoy their knowledge, then you are also imbibing it through them. And he says this act of participating in happiness is one of the foundations. If you want to be happy, it has to be followed. And he says, why do we say that when somebody is in pain, give them compassion? Don't give them sympathy, because sympathy becomes fake. So let's say, and he gives the example of Buddha, and he says that, let's say you are in suffering, and the Buddha is also giving you sympathy, and he's saying, I'm also crying because you're crying. How does that help? It doesn't help the person who's crying, right? Or if the person is suffering and you are like, oh, this doesn't bother me, how does that help the person? So what the Buddha would give there is compassion. You should have compassion for the person who is suffering, so that we are able to uplift them, we're able to sort of actually be of some practical use, rather than just mouthing whatever words and also saying, I feel your pain. How does that help the person? So compassion is what is needed. Okay, and compassion can be active also. It is not just a feeling, right? So why do we have indifference towards evil? This also Osho explains very well. He says that whenever we fix our mind on something that we don't like, we create that as a thing, right? So if I constantly think, I don't like this, I don't like this, I don't like that person, I don't like their actions, your entire mind is focusing on what you don't like, and you're making it an active event or an active action, and you're creating a relationship with the negative. So the mind starts focusing on the negative and becomes negative. Therefore, it's very important to cultivate indifference towards evil. And I think this is something that we see very much with social media. The more we focus on the negative, the more we amplify it, right? So that is essentially why we cultivate indifference towards evil. It doesn't mean that you turn away or that you allow evil to happen. It is that you don't allow it to put its hooks into you, and you don't you're not pulled by it. You're not made a puppet to it. Okay. Barbara Stoller Miller says, tranquility of thought comes through the cultivation of friendship, compassion, joy, impartiality, and spheres of pleasure and pain, virtue or vice. And she also compares it to the teachings of the Buddha. Okay, it is basically that these virtues, these four virtues, were basically cultivated by the Buddhist monks to effect, because they believe that there's an cultivating these, they call the immeasurables in Buddhism, they call the immeasurable virtues. When these are cultivated, they create a very tangible change in the perceived relationship that we have to other people on earth. So this work is basically of demolishing boundaries between oneself and others to break through the barriers erected by egotism, the ego, the ahankara. Okay, so in Buddhist terms, these practices bring about a transmutation of personal emotions into immeasurable virtues. And through this impartiality towards all beings, of love, of compassion, kindness, joy, our mind is stabilized and universalized. So we are no longer operating from a selfish point of view. It is not just me that we are undertaking this practice for. I hope this was useful to you. Please do come back tomorrow for Sutra number 34.